My parents handed me a rent increase notice for $1,900 a month, demanding I pay market rate for the small guest house behind their property. They smiled like they were doing me a favor, claiming it was time I contributed fairly. But when I peeked at the financial ledger sitting on their kitchen counter, the truth hit me like a bucket of ice water. Every extra dollar they demanded from me was going straight into my brother's failing luxury coffee shop venture. They thought they could squeeze me dry to keep their golden child's sinking ship afloat. So I didn't argue. I didn't scream. I just signed the papers, packed my things, and let them play out their plan. My name is Suzanne. I'm 34 years old, and until recently I thought I had a solid, supportive relationship with my parents. For the past 2 years, I'd been living in the converted guest cottage behind their main house. It was a win-win arrangement. I paid them $900 a month, a fair agreed-upon rent that helped cover their property taxes, while allowing me to aggressively save money for a down payment on a place of my own. I worked hard, kept to myself, and never missed a single payment. Then came a Tuesday evening that changed everything. My parents invited me over to the main house under the pretense of having dinner. But as soon as I walked into the kitchen, there was no food on the table. There was just a single piece of paper pushed toward my seat. It was a formal, typed 30-day notice. My father cleared his throat while my mother gave me a tight, practiced smile. Starting next month, my rent was jumping from $900 to $1,900, a $1,000 increase overnight. I sat there stunned, asking them how they could possibly justify doubling my rent without warning. My father leaned back, folded his arms, and calmly told me that $1,900 was simply the market rate for the area. He claimed it was high time I contributed fairly to the household, framing it as a lesson in real-world responsibility. Their tone was so smug, so calculated, that I knew right then this wasn't about market rates at all. The very next afternoon, I went back to the main house to return a spare set of kitchen keys. My parents weren't home, but as I set the keys on the dining table, my eyes caught sight of an open leather ledger next to a stack of bank statements. Curiosity won. I took a closer look. What I saw made my blood run cold. Page after page listed frantic, heavy money transfers going out to one specific account. My 31-year-old brother, Julian. Julian was the undisputed golden child of the family. 6 months earlier, he decided to quit his corporate job to open an artisanal luxury cafe downtown. He had zero experience, a grand ego, and a habit of expecting everyone else to bail him out whenever things went sideways. According to the statements, his cafe was hemorrhaging cash. He was already defaulting on his commercial lease, backed up on payroll, and drowning in vendor debts. My parents had already drained a huge chunk of their own savings trying to keep his vanity project afloat. That was when the puzzle pieces clicked into place. My sudden $1,000 rent hike had nothing to do with market rates or teaching me a lesson in adult responsibility. They were trying to squeeze me dry to create a guaranteed monthly cash injection for Julian's failing dream. Growing up, it had always been like this. When Julian crashed his first car, they bought him a new one while I drove a rusted, beat-up sedan I paid for myself. When he dropped out of college, they covered his debts. But when I worked 2 jobs to graduate, I barely got a congratulations. They were using my hard-earned savings as a piggy bank for their favorite son. Any normal person would have lost their mind, stormed into the living room, and screamed at their parents for using them. But I knew how my family operated. If I fought back, they'd spin the narrative, label me selfish, and accuse me of hating my brother. So I decided to play a completely different game. When my parents called me later that evening, expecting an argument, I looked them straight in the eye and said, "Okay, I'll sign the new lease terms starting next month." The look of sheer relief on their faces was almost tragic. They actually thought they'd successfully manipulated me into bankrolling Julian's failure. My mother even gave me a condescending hug, praising me for finally stepping up for the family. What they didn't know was that the moment I walked back to my cottage, I called a property manager downtown. Using the savings I'd been guarding for years, I immediately signed a lease on a bright, beautiful 1-bedroom apartment that would be available in 3 weeks. While securing my new place, I also did a quick public record search on my parents' property. That was when I discovered something massive. The cottage I was living in had never been legally permitted as a separate rental unit by the city. Not only were my parents charging me rent on an illegal rental unit, but they were also quietly trying to secure a secondary home equity loan on the property using my supposed market rate lease as proof of income to back Julian's bank applications. They were digging their own grave, and I was simply going to let them step into it. For the next 3 weeks, I played the part of the beautiful daughter. I smiled during Sunday dinners. I listened to my parents brag about Julian's brilliant expansion plans. I nodded along as they talked about how much my new $1,900 rent payment was going to help stabilize things. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, I was packing my life into boxes and moving them into a secure storage, unit bit by bit. The day my new lease officially began was a Saturday. It was also the exact day my parents and Julian were out celebrating at an expensive steakhouse. A dinner paid for on credit to mark the signing of my new lease. While they were out raising their glasses to my forced sacrifice, a moving truck backed up to the guest cottage. Within 3 hours, every single piece of furniture, every clothing item, and every personal belonging I owned was loaded up and driven away. I cleaned the cottage until it sparkled. Then I left the keys on the kitchen counter, locked the door behind me, and walked away forever. Around 9 p.m., my phone exploded. It started with 5 missed calls from my mother, followed by a barrage of furious text messages from my father. They had come home expecting to collect my first $1,900 check. Instead, they found an empty, dark cottage. When I finally answered, my father was practically screaming into the receiver. He demanded to know where I was, calling me an ungrateful, selfish traitor. "You ruined everything," he yelled. "Julian's bank approval relies on the rental income from that unit. How could you do this to your own family?" I listened quietly until he ran out of breath. Then, in a calm, steady voice, I replied, "I told you I signed a lease for $1,900 a month, Dad. I just never said it was for your cottage." The moment I hung up that phone, the dominoes began to fall much faster than even I had anticipated. My parents had been counting on my $1,900 monthly payment to serve as documented income. They needed that guaranteed cash flow to secure a secondary home equity line of credit, which they had promised to hand over to Julian's commercial lenders as collateral. Without my signature on their lease, and without that monthly deposit hitting their bank account, their loan application completely collapsed overnight. 3 days later, the real nightmare began for them. The bank's underwriting team called my parents to conduct a mandatory audit of the revenue claims listed on their application. When the loan officer asked for verified tax documents and proof of occupancy for the rental unit, my parents panicked. They tried to claim that their tenant had suddenly broken the lease, but the bank decided to inspect the property records directly. That was when everything blew wide open. The bank's underwriters discovered that the guest cottage was entirely unpermitted by the city. It was an illegal residential rental unit. Not only had my parents submitted false documentation claiming legal rental income, but they had also committed loan fraud by inflating their property's official leverage capacity to back Julian's business venture. The bank immediately froze their credit lines and flagged their existing accounts for suspicious activity. But the fallout didn't stop at the bank. Because the loan audit brought the illegal structure to light, the bank's compliance department was required to report the discrepancy to the City Housing Board. Within a week, a formal municipal inspector showed up at my parents' front door. They were issued a heavy fine for zoning violations and served with a mandatory cease and desist order. My parents had tried to back me into a corner to save their golden child. Instead, their own greed and dishonesty triggered an unstoppable legal and financial avalanche that exposed every single lie they had built their plan upon. With their credit lines frozen and the bank pulling out, the illusion of Julian's successful business shattered into pieces almost overnight. Without the cash injection my parents had promised him, Julian couldn't pay his commercial rent, cover payroll for his staff, or settle his outstanding invoices with coffee bean distributors. Within 2 weeks, his suppliers cut off shipments. His employees walked out after receiving bounce checks, and his landlord served him with an eviction notice. The artisanal luxury cafe folded completely, leaving Julian with over $150,000 in personal debt and zero income. Back at my parents' house, the devastation was just as absolute. The city fined them thousands of dollars for the unpermitted guest house and ordered them to remove the kitchen appliances immediately. Worse, the bank demanded full repayment on the initial funds they had advanced during the loan application process. Between the municipal fines, the bank penalties, and Julian's defaulted debts that they had co-signed for, my parents were faced with total financial ruin. To cover the mounting debts, they were forced to put their beloved main house up for sale at a steep discount just to avoid complete bankruptcy. That was when the desperate phone calls started pouring into my phone again. This time, the anger was gone. It was replaced by pathetic, tearful pleas. My mother called me crying about how Julian was depressed and how they were on the verge of losing their home. My father, who had called me an ungrateful traitor just weeks earlier, sent me a long email asking if I could co-sign a new loan for them. They even offered to let me move back into the main house completely rent-free if I would just use my savings to clear Julian's immediate debts. They weren't apologizing because they felt guilty for how they had treated me. They were apologizing because the consequences of their own actions had finally caught up to them, and they desperately needed someone to pay the bill. I sat in my new downtown apartment, looking out at the city skyline, and made a decision. I didn't yell. I didn't trash them in return. I simply sent a brief final message to our family group chat. I love you, but I will no longer set myself on fire to keep Julian warm. I wish you all the best. Then I blocked their numbers. It's been 6 months since that day. My parents ended up downsizing into a tiny 2-bedroom condo, and Julian is working a retail job to pay off his mountain of debt. Meanwhile, I'm thriving. My savings are intact. My career is progressing. And for the first time in my life, I have peace of mind. I learned the hard way that blood doesn't give anyone the right to exploit you. Setting boundaries isn't selfish. It's survival. And sometimes the strongest thing you can do for yourself is walk away from the people who only love you when you're useful to them.